Olá, eu sou a Sofia, do time de Novas Ideias no Laboratório de Ciências para a Educação, EduLab 21, do Instituto Ayrton Senna. O conteúdo que vocês vão assistir é uma palestra ministrada pelo professor Dr. Oliver John, da Universidade da Califórnia, Berkeley, e membro do Comitê Científico do EduLab. Nesta palestra, o professor John apresenta a organização conceitual do modelo das competências socioemocionais. Por se tratar de um tema que ainda gera dúvidas em todos aqueles que trabalham com educação, é importante que se possa organizar conceitualmente essas competências. Há uma grande quantidade de termos e de definições para os aspectos relacionados a essas competências, e em outras linhas de estudo, na educação, na psicologia e em outras áreas do conhecimento, que possuem propostas variadas para esta organização. A escolha por uma dessas formas de organizar não diminui a validade de haver múltiplas abordagens, já que não existe apenas um caminho correto para essa definição. O EduLab 21 optou por adotar um modelo conceitual para as competências socioemocionais, que é um modelo de personalidade que reúne uma ampla gama de evidências empíricas, tendo sido replicado em diferentes países. Espero que a palestra seja produtiva para você. Aproveite!
Well, because in the school setting, different schools have different problems. They have to address different children, different contexts, and so they focus on different kinds of socio-emotional skills. So most of these models were not developed as general models, but certain schools focus on problems like creativity. They want to improve the creativity, the curiosity in the children. In another school, there may be issues with violence and crime. And so they need to work on interpersonal skills like empathy and respect and trust. Yeah, so it was fascinating when the economists discovered that there are skills that are not just kind of how quickly you can solve problems or how good your memory is, right? These kinds of cognitive skills that allow you to solve math problems. They initially said, oh, here are other kinds of skills, and since we don't really know what they are, we're going to call them non-cognitive. But that's not a very good label, because if you think about empathy, that involves my mind, right? That involves me thinking about what is the other person feeling? What are their needs? What are their concerns? So it's not like for these socio-emotional skills, I turn my brain off. They are also part of thinking and experiencing the world. So in the business world, they called these skills people skills or soft skills. Now, my feelings are hurt to say these are soft skills, and learning how to do math, that's a hard skill. I mean, in many ways, you could say empathy is much harder than math, right? It's much harder to figure out and teach to skills. The term that I like is one that has been used in Canada, and they call them transferable skills. That means that you can carry them with you from one context to another. And that's a really nice example, because we want our kids to take these socio-emotional skills from school to college or into their marriage or into their work. So these are skills that you can think of, they're in a little suitcase, right? And you pack them in your suitcase and you take them with you throughout your entire life. So if you want to have a term other than socio-emotional skills, then I would go with the transferable skills. But I like socio-emotional skills because they recognize something fundamental about our schools, and that is that schools are social places, right? You need to get along with teachers and with other kids. And they're also emotional places because lots of emotional stuff happens. If I get a bad grade back, I'm sad. If the teacher doesn't allow me to write the essay about a question that I really like, I'm frustrated or I might be angry, all right? If my best friend moves, I'm sad. So those are issues, that emphasize that schools are both social and emotional places, and so those are really good labels for these kinds of skills. No. I mean, the amazing thing is that we're finally recognizing that these socio-emotional competencies are critical throughout all kinds of important contexts. And so the UNESCO is probably the most important example, because they're saying skills are there in general to help us perform tasks and solve problems. And what that means is that the socio-emotional characteristics are also skills because they help us deal with problems, solve problems in domains not just like education and training, but also when later we have a job, when we have problems in our relationships, in our marriages, with our children, when we need to manage our health, when we worry about well-being and happiness. So those are all domains that are critical. And it is in this context that the UNESCO has said that these non-cognitive skills are critical because they help us solve the problems of life. So I sometimes even would like to call them life skills because, as I said earlier, they're transferable skills that allow us to be better solvers of issues and problems throughout our lifespan. Well, if we're thinking of skills, they need to have a certain stability. In other words, that there have to be effects of these skills on behavior, on the kinds of feelings that we have, on the kinds of thoughts and cognitions that we have. And they have to be relatively consistently evident over time and situations. So that's one thing, that they are detectable on a consistent basis. The second piece is that they're also learned, that we can practice them, just like I practice empathy with my kids. And it's something that we do on a recurring basis, so that we learn, that we develop these kinds of skills both through informal and formal education and life experiences. And then the third piece is that if these are really socio-emotional skills, then they should connect up with important outcomes. And we sometimes say socioeconomic, and what we mean by that, it's not just about making more money when we're grown-ups, but that it's also important for our relationships, for our citizenship, for our involvement with our neighborhoods, with clubs and the civic community. Well, in the early days, there were very smart and thoughtful people who proposed a list of core characteristics. And there's been wonderful work, but the problem is, just like the schools, any individual has their own specific preferences and priorities. And so you often see an emphasis on empathy, on getting along, being respectful, and doing, as you are told, but then those conceptions forget important things like creativity and curiosity. Often people forget to include engagement with others. And so psychologists realize that no single individual can put together a truly comprehensive taxonomy or framework. And to do that, we have to work together and we have to use scientific principles. So that is an evidence-based approach. And over about 30 years, researchers from different laboratories, from different countries, different groups of people that they've studied have made an effort to collaborate and find out whether there is a general taxonomy that we can replicate in different countries. And so the idea of replication is really the critical thing in science, that it's not what I think or what you think, but what we consistently find over and over again when we look at these socio-emotional characteristics in different countries and settings. So this idea that there is an underlying broad, general taxonomy was very critical. And amazingly, I actually did not expect that in my lifetime I would see this problem solved, but there is now general consensus that we have these broad domains, 5 broad domains that we can use to summarize what the core or the kind of the most important of these socio-emotional characteristics are. The idea was that there would be a broad and comprehensive model that would really address all the major socio-emotional characteristics that had been identified and suggested, but at the same time would have parsimony, that we are not ending up with thousands of different socio-emotional skills. And in a way, the work went like what we would call today crowdsourcing, right? That different groups all over the world were working together on developing this model. And it has shown that there are 5 broad domains that we can use to summarize the more specific socio-emotional skills that we want to distinguish in the school context. And the Brazilian team here has been centered at the Institute Ayrton Senna, and the work was started by 2 Brazilian researchers, Ricardo Primi and Daniel Santos, who reviewed all of the existing work and then pulled together questions and items that could be used to define these particular skills. And what was wonderful is that they didn't just include scientists. They studied more than 120 students from public schools. They obtained ratings from teachers and got information from school principals, so that really the effort here in Brazil was again comprehensive, but then focused on a manageable set of attributes. So what we now have are these 5 broad domains and 17 more specific concepts that we call facets that are summarized in the next slide. So my favorite domain in the entire Big 5 model is openness. And it is such a crucial 21st century dimension because it is about exploring and learning about the world. And there's a great quote from Albert Einstein, who emphasized that even though everybody thinks he's so incredibly smart, he said the most important piece driving his work, his discoveries, was that he was passionately curious. So that's his word, that he had a passion for understanding things, for figuring things out, for making sense of things. And so curiosity is the first of the more specific pieces in the openness domain. And if you talk to kids, they all get that. They all have this curiosity. And so part of our job as teachers and parents and educators is to foster, to increase the kids' curiosity and help them explore and understand things. And as a teacher myself, I am happiest when I can get the kids to be curious about the topics that I'm trying to teach them about. And getting that mental involvement and fascination that kids can develop is absolutely wonderful to see. Now, it's not enough to just be curious. We also want the kids to look at the world in a different way. And for me, the best example of this is the speech that Steve Jobs gave when he introduced the iPhone for the first time. And he said, and it's kind of an interesting way of thinking about this. He said, we reimagined the phone, right? I mean, I have that old phone. I still had a phone that had a little rotating dial. The new iPhone doesn't look like this at all, but it still allows you to make phone calls, but it does all these other amazing things as well. And so that's what creative imagination is about, to kind of rethink, reimagine things and transform them and come up with something new. So again, really critical, this creativity and imagination piece. And then the third piece in openness, and I'm so glad to see that Brazilians are still teaching this, they're still valuing this, is the artistic and aesthetic side. That we are teaching our kids to be appreciative of art and music. And it's not just artistic stuff, it's also design. I mean, a beautiful house, that's architecture. Or to go back to the iPhone, you know, it looks beautiful. It is aesthetically pleasing. So these are skills, these are an ability to look at the world, to look at even an object that is really quite critical. And there's actually research now by neuroscientists that says that being involved in artistic activities has sort of a fundamental human need. And the idea here is that when we are part of a group putting on a play, when we are part of a production at school, when we work on a mural, on a painting together, we're feeling that we belong, that we are part of something bigger than us. And it's this idea that artistic and aesthetic activities and involvement can sort of elevate us from kind of the mundane, boring things of life into something that means more than just me. And that often has kind of a connection with others. So I'm very excited to see that the arts, that music plays, performances play such a great part in our Brazilian schools. Well, it turns out that openness, the openness-related skills, right, like creative imagination and curiosity, helps with kids learning in school. Because if you're curious about it, you pay attention and you get more out of a lesson, out of a project, and so on. But there's a great saying by a colleague of mine at Stanford, Carol Dweck, who said, even geniuses need to work hard. But the idea here is that we need to put in the time and the effort and be able to focus on our tasks, at our jobs, at the work that we have to do. And we call this dimension conscientious self-management. The idea of self-management is really that the little kid that goes to school, they're really managing themselves. They're like a little CEO, like an executive in a company. Well, their company involves organizing all their belongings and having their school books in the right place and getting to school on time and keeping track of things like homework. So these are all kind of management, organizational planning kinds of activities. And so the first core component or piece of self-management is determination, which means that we need to be able to set goals for ourselves, that we need to be able to come up with ways of formulating what's important and pursue those goals. So sometimes people call this setting high standards. Now, is it enough to have, you know, high standards and high expectations for ourselves? No, we also need to be able to organize ourselves. So that's the example of my kids in the morning have to get their backpack ready. And so one of the things that I try to teach them is that we get our backpack ready the night before so that we don't have to run around in the morning looking for our, English language book or the math homework, that we plan and organize our activities beforehand. Another example is that it's really important to learn when you play a game and you take all these things out, that you need to then put them away again, that you organize your belongings and your schoolwork and your activities. So organization is a second important piece. Now, is it enough to be organized? Well, there's always lots of other things that impinge on us, that want to get our attention away. And so my favorite example with my own children and also with my college students are cell phones, right? So my students are in the class, they're supposed to listen to me, but then there's something interesting that happens on their cell phones. Should they be looking at their cell phones and get distracted from what we're working on together in class? Well, I think that we need to work more on our concentration skills. So focus or concentration is a really important skill, now even more today than 50 years ago, where we need to be able to block out other distractions and focus on the thing that is critical so that we can actually get it done and finish. So the fourth piece that's absolutely critical is not just that we focus on the thing, but that we can see it through. And it's often called persistence, or perseverancia is often the Brazilian term. I have a colleague, Angela Duckworth in the United States, who calls it grit. And by grit, she means sort of that you really kind of stick to it, that you kind of don't let it go until you can get it to the next step, until you get it done. So to that kind of that we can stick with this project and finish it, and then we go outside and play, or then we, get our cell phone back and do some enjoyable activity. But the idea here is that we need to stick with it for a while to kind of reach our goals. And then finally, not only do we want to work on our own goals, but we also want to take responsibility for the experiences, the quality of life of other members of our community. So if I act in ways that are irresponsible, that can hurt other people, when I don't follow rules about letting, pedestrians pass, then I could be hurting people. So responsible decision making is the final and a very critical part of this broad domain of managing myself, my behavior, my impulses, so that I get things done and that I interact well with other people in my community. So socio-emotional characteristics are clearly helpful for children to learn better, to benefit more from the lessons, from the classes that they have. And openness and conscientious self-management are really critical examples of that. But it is not only sitting and learning something for yourself that's important in life. It's also getting along with other people. And so this is now the interpersonal domain where we need to develop skills that allow us to engage with others and to have positive, rewarding, loving, long-term relationships with others. So there are, again, two dimensions that are critical. The first one is engaging with others. And if you think about, I've practiced this with my kids, because when you meet somebody, it's really nice to look at them, to make eye contact, to say hello, to introduce yourself. And it's a skill that is going to be very critical, when you want to join a team, when you want to ask, can I play too? When you are going to apply for a job. I mean, all of these involve you making some steps towards the other person. Thus, we call this engagement with others. And the first of these is social initiative, taking the initiative to kind of join others, to get involved and engaged with them. And it's something that people often don't realize how important these skills are, because if you can't make that first step, it's much less likely that others will ask you to join. If you can signal, if you can, make eye contact and smile at somebody, they will know, oh, this person is interested. They might actually want to join my team, and you're more likely to be invited. So it's a two-way street. And it's critical for our children to be able to kind of make that first step, to join a group, to participate, to get involved. So making the first step, engaging, having social initiative, it is not entirely enough, because there is another piece that involves standing up for ourselves and standing up for others. And Americans call this assertiveness, which may be hard to translate into Portuguese, but the idea is that we are expressing an opinion, that we are sharing a feeling, that we are taking a stand, even if other people may not like it. And this is particularly important for women to find your voice, to say no, to be clear about the things that you want and that you don't want. And it's a critical piece in the school context, because we see little kids who are so shy and so unassertive that they don't know how to ask the teacher a question, so that their needs are not being met. And so we need to teach our kids to feel free enough to sometimes people say it's courage, it's bravery, right? To be courageous enough to speak up and find your voice and say, teacher, I don't understand this, or teacher, I disagree with that. Or to say the same thing when you see another kid being bullied, where you can stand up for another person. So assertiveness doesn't have to be selfish. It doesn't have to be about me getting things, but it's also being courageous to defend and take care of others. So that's assertiveness. And then the third piece is enthusiasm. Enthusiasm is, of course, what I want to see in my students as a teacher. And it is so wonderful to see the kids being happy and happily engaged with what we're doing in a lesson, what we're doing. Like we have an outing, we have a class trip, we're having an exciting new project. So seeing that excitement in the kids is absolutely critical. Now, I want to acknowledge that it's also hard to do. So even the best teachers, there will be days when the kids are bored. And if you're struggling with kids being bored and kids not being enthusiastic here in Brazil, be reassured you're not the only ones. It turns out we did a study recently in Denmark, and it turns out that the Danish kids, right? So Denmark, a lot more money, a lot of, much less problems that people have to deal with. And it turns out even there, 2/3 of the time, kids are bored in their classes. They say classes are so boring, right? So it's a challenge for us as teachers and educators, but it's a challenge that we need to absolutely face, and we need to work on helping the kids, develop enthusiasm for the kind of ideas and work that we're doing with them. So engaging with others is clearly the first step. But if we just engage, and we engage with 100 or 1,000 or 500,000 people, that does not help us have long-term, warm, close relationships with the people that are in our direct environment. And it's most easily imagined is that we have warm, loving feelings towards members of our family. But that's also true. For me as a teacher, I want to welcome, the students and let the students know that I'm glad to see them and that I'm going to be glad to see them tomorrow and that I'm glad that they are part of my life. And so we call this amabilidade. It turns out that the Portuguese word is the best word that we have for this. The terms in English are actually not so good. And it captures that the other person is our friend, that we see the other person as somebody that we value, that we care about, that we want to take care of. And so if you want to have an analogy, it's really the way parents love their child. And if we can teach students and teachers that same attitude towards others, then I think our schools are going to be transformed. They're going to be much more positive, wonderful places that people want to be in. And so what makes for amabilidade? One of the core things is empathy, that we are learning to be better at understanding, appreciating, figuring out what others are feeling, what the other person's needs are. And again, I as a teacher can try to do that by taking the perspective of the students. I can think about, that they may have had a stressful morning, that they have already had a job where they have work, that they may not have gotten enough sleep. And if I can look at the students from that perspective, then the fact that they are tired may not hurt my feelings. It may help me, be a more positive force in their life. So empathy is absolutely core to all relationships. And a second piece, and that I think is absolutely critical, I insist on in my classroom, is respect. And it's not just that I want my students to respect me, but also I respect them. And I'm very clear about this, that I'm going to stick to certain kinds of rules, that I'm not going to go on longer in my classes than the hour goes, that I'm going to be respectful of their feelings, of their time, and so on. So the idea here is that respect is earned, I always say. So as a teacher, if I treat my students with respect, I'm likely to get respect back for them. So really, it's important to think about not something that I get to be respected because I'm old or because I'm, a teacher, but because of the way I behave in my interactions with the students. And then the third one in amabilidade is that we couldn't have relationships with people if there was no trust. And if you think about, that I'm here in Brazil, talking to you about socioemotional skills, well, I could be wondering what's going on at my house. Is there like a car parked and somebody is visiting my house who shouldn't be visiting the house? Well, this is what trust is about, that I trust my wife, I trust my kids, that they are going to do the right thing, that they're going to make good decisions. So trust is really the fundamental piece that I can expect other people to do as they say. And so that's really important, that I as a teacher also show my students that if I say I'm going to grade the exam and I'll bring it back in tomorrow, that I will actually do that the kids can learn that trust is possible. And it's a big issue, especially with teenagers, that they're not sure that they can trust adults. And so as a teacher, we are first in line to show them that adults are trustworthy. And so learning, increasing our trust in individuals and teachers, in organizations, maybe even in the government, is a really critical piece of having warm, loving relationships. So emotions are one of those wonderful but also difficult things, because I can be happy and joyous and have feelings of pride, but sometimes things go wrong. And in the school context, we have situations where that are stressful, where I'm feeling anxious, where I need to put up with frustrations, where I need to cope with anger or sadness. And so these are called by psychologists the core negative emotions that are very important, because they signal to us something isn't going right. You need to pay attention, right? What do you need to do here to cope with the situation? But we need to make sure that negative emotions don't go out of hand. If the situation is frustrating and I get really angry and I get more angry and then I punch somebody, that is not okay. And in fact, kids get much better from age 2 and 3 and 4 when they hit each other and so on, to kind of finding ways to work out problems and conflicts in a productive, sensible manner. So how we are regulating, how we are dealing with these negative emotions is a very critical domain of learning and development that psychologists have long been interested in, and that the schools are now finally addressing as well. So the first one that we want to emphasize is toleration of stress, or stress tolerance, where it's really important not to say, oh no, there should be no stress. Instead, we need to teach children how to manage stress. There will always be some stressful periods in our lives, and sometimes stress is a wonderful way to grow and move on and become a kind of more complex or interesting person. So it's not that we need to shield our kids from stress, but we need to teach them how to effectively deal with it. And there are wonderful ways to manage stress that we can practice in the school context. So that's dealing with stress. A second important piece is self-confidence, that we are able to approach a difficult situation and say, I think I can deal with this. This will be hard, but I'm confident that I will be able to manage this and come out okay on the other side. And so the problem that we sometimes have is we get anxious, we worry about things, and then kids and adults do the same thing, is that we avoid what makes us anxious. And this avoidance is not good, because we feel anxious because we know there is something that needs to be addressed, that we need to deal with. So self-confidence is really helpful for us to tackle difficult subjects, difficult problems that we're not sure about, but that we can then talk ourselves through and work up the courage to actually tackle them and get through safe on the other side. So those are two core ones. There's one that is really critical in the school context and also applies to relationships, and that's anger and frustration. And so we call this frustration tolerance, because again, there will be situations where I can't get what I want, and I have to be able to learn to tolerate those kinds of frustrations and find smart and clever ways maybe to get what I want, but not necessarily by going with my head first through a wall or punching people or having intense conflicts. So it's something that adults often don't realize, how frustrating things can be for kids, and that they need help with dealing with frustration and anger. Well, 17 is better than 160 or 1,000, as some people have suggested. There's all these long lists of socio-emotional skills that our kids should have or should develop, should learn. And so what's really important to realize is that you don't have to work on all 17 every day. So when I'm sitting at the dinner table with my kids, what we might do is practicing empathy or practicing respect and taking turns, so that we would say, you know, we have all these lovely chocolates, and instead of, you know, the oldest kid picking out all the ones that she wants and nobody else gets their first choice, we take turns. And it's a lovely way to kind of practice, you know, amabilidade. And on a different day, we might be working on something else. And so in the same way in the classroom, you can make a choice. It is not a model that says you must practice all 17 skills. If a school wants to have an emphasis on arts and aesthetics, and that's the only thing that they want to work on, I would say great. That's a marvelous, wonderful, important skill for them to work on. And so it really depends on the needs of the school, of the context of the kids that we want to address. And so the 17 is really kind of a long, extensive list from which you can choose what fits your particular context and need. And that's also why the Big Five are such a useful organizing scheme, that you could say, you know, maybe we need to work on the kids getting better at their learning strategies. So we can say, maybe we should focus on organization, or we should focus on some other piece of the self-management domain. So you can think of these as little Lego pieces, right? That there's different kinds of pieces and you use them for different purposes. And today you might want to use those 5 Lego pieces, or in another day, maybe those 3. So you can choose, you can build them together into interesting combinations. There isn't really any rules. This is not a model that says you must do these 17 and only those 17, but there is enough choice for educators and teachers to put together their own program that makes sense for them.